All right. Well, thank you guys for joining this morning on this workshop, really speaking to families about how to be successful with financial aid applications. And just to introduce myself very quickly, my name is Paul Martin. I'm the founder of College Money Method. And what I do is work with families individually to help them be successful in the financial aid process. So what that means is that oftentimes families are looking to take advantage of need-based financial aid and how to maximize any kind of financial aid to be eligible for. But as well, many families are focused on merit scholarships and how to find the most merit scholarship money. So I work with both types of families, and a lot of families we're working on both objectives. And it's important that we can make college affordable for students, whether they're in the US or international. And so I really want to help as many families as possible be successful at this process. As it says there, I'm a member of the National College Advocacy Group. We're a group of planners, financial planners, and also college counselors who help promote college accessibility and affordability. I'm working on my certified financial planner, and I work a lot with my two alma maters in the alumni groups, volunteering with students who are first in their family to attend college. So quickly getting to today's topic, really wanted to start with the cost of attendance and have, I'm sure you're very aware as you're looking at the sticker price of college, that the true cost of attendance is well beyond tuition at this point. We're talking about many additional costs, whether it's housing, meals, books, travel, and personal expenses. But what a lot of families aren't aware is that depending on the type of school, this could make up to 75% of the overall college budget annually. So these additional costs can add up, and we want to always make sure we're budgeting and thinking about what all of that investment is on a 1 year and on a 4-year basis. So that's why so many families are turning to financial aid, because it's really the money to help you bridge the gap between what you could afford today and that total cost of attendance. And I work mostly with families on helping them get the most out of this green zone, which is that grants and scholarships. If you're a US citizen, you have access to federal grants and state grants potentially, but the majority of money for all students, whether you're US based or international, is going to come from need-based grants or merit-based scholarship that the colleges themselves are administering as they either assess your financial situation or they look at your students' academic performance and understand kind of what kind of eligibility you would have for those scholarships. Of course, there are other types of potential financial aid that are available specifically to US citizens. These are loans and work study from the federal government, and these are considered self-help because clearly there's money you're going to use today, money that your students either going to earn today or borrow against their future to help pay for college. Now, the building blocks of understanding financial aid in the US are really first thinking about what your expected family contribution is. And that's a number that's derived from one of two financial aid applications. The first one, and I'll talk a little bit about, quite a bit about today, is FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid. They use one methodology looking at your income, assets, and other household information to determine expected ability to pay. And College Board has a CSS Profile Application, which many private schools use as a supplement for domestic students, but is one of the primary applications for international students if the school is offering their international students need-based financial aid to evaluate a family and a student's circumstances to determine whether they're eligible. Well, the reason why they come up with this expected family contribution is they really are looking to see if you have what's called demonstrated financial need, which is eligibility for financial aid based off of your financial circumstances. But that's not the only piece. We also have to put together a college's financial aid policy and understand whether they're providing financial aid based off of need or primarily need, which would require you to have need, or whether in fact they have a robust bank of merit scholarships that they're offering as a way to reduce the cost. Now, many colleges will require financial aid applications for both, even if you're looking for merit-based aid. So you have to really understand the requirements of a specific college. So this expected family contribution number doesn't have to be a mystery. I actually have a calculator on my website that allows you to go and calculate under Families Resources tab what your estimated expected family contribution would be for this coming application cycle, particularly if using the FAFSA. So this calculator only really works for domestic students because international students, unless you are a US citizen, aren't eligible and living abroad aren't eligible to use FAFSA in order to apply for need-based financial aid. But this could be a great resource for you if you're looking to quickly understand what your expected family contribution is, because the reason why that's important is because every college uses this fundamental equation to come up with your demonstrated financial need, or essentially your financial aid eligibility. So they take their full cost of attendance, they subtract out the expected family contribution that's calculated from FAFSA, if they're using primarily FAFSA or CSS Profile, to determine whether you have need and whether you're eligible for need-based financial aid. What can be surprising for families, though, is that your need-based aid can vary quite a bit depending on the college and the circumstances of that cost of attendance. So for example, coming from a California resident, at USC, a family with an expected family contribution of about $35,000 would have quite a bit of financial need. You can see $43,500 of need. Whereas if they were applying as an in-state student and got admitted to UCLA, they would be eligible for no need-based financial aid. And University of Washington, being an out-of-state option with a higher price tag than an in-state option, is somewhere in the middle. So be aware that you can use this fundamental equation if you understand, and you can calculate your EFC either using my calculator or other resources to see what schools you might match for need-based aid and which schools like this family would have to rely on merit-based aid from UCLA in order to make that price tag of $34,000 more affordable. Now, I'm going to first turn for the next about 20 minutes and talk about need-based financial aid application process, and then I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about merit-based aid, which is what a lot of families are going to be interested in as well. So there are two applications that I mentioned for need-based financial aid. There's the free application for federal student aid that's administered by the U.S. Department of Education, known as FAFSA. It is required by all colleges if you're a domestic student, because it calculates, like I said, in expected family contributions that a college can look at to understand your financial aid eligibility. But importantly, it's the application that unlocks access to all federal student aid programs. And I'm not going to have time to review what those programs are, but the federal government has grants. It has a work study program, as I mentioned, term time jobs that students can work to earn money, and it has loans. Now, importantly, even if you're not qualifying for need-based aid, but you think your student wants to take advantage of the student federal loan program, you do need to submit the FAFSA at your specific college that you're applying to or admitted to in order to get access to the student federal loan. CSS Profile is administered by the College Board. These are the same friends who administer SAT and AP AP tests, excuse me. It's a fee application, so it does cost money to apply per school, and it's required by about 150 colleges, as I had mentioned. It uses its own what's called institutional methodology, because it's developed by the institutions that use the CSS profile versus the federal government. But each college can customize that EFC formula in order to determine their own institutional awards. And I'm going to walk through that process. Now, importantly, there's a fee waiver for families earning less than $100,000. So you can apply for financial aid free if you're under that threshold. So let's understand the financial aid process in a little more detail. So if a school is relying on FAFSA to determine all of their financial aid package, this is the process. So the student and the parent enter financial information and household information, and the FAFSA does three critical things. It calculates a federal EFC. In fact, when you're done with your application on the resolution screen, it will tell you what that calculation is. It will give you a number saying, this is your expected family contribution based off of the information you've put in. It determines eligibility for federal aid, and importantly, all colleges want to use eligible federal aid to package together for students in order to make the financial aid package as robust as possible. And then it passes financial information to colleges that comes in through the FAFSA in order for them to award institutional aid. So colleges that only use FAFSA will use that FAFSA financial data and the federal EFC to calculate whether you're eligible for additional institutional aid that can supplement federal student aid. If a college uses CSS Profile, you still have to submit the FAFSA because the colleges that use CSS Profile still want to take advantage of all federal student aid that your student would be eligible for, but they use the information you're going to put into the College Board CSS Profile application in order to calculate their own EFC and determine whether or not they're going to award additional institutional aid to your student based on their own understanding of your expected family contribution. Okay, so dates and timelines. So a week from today, October 1st, all these applications will be open for next academic year. So starting 2023-24 academic year, you're going to be able to start applying next Saturday. But importantly, this is not the deadline. You do not have to submit by October 1st. This is only the open date. The application deadline is actually dependent on the admission cycle which your student is applying. So effectively, if your student is applying early decision or early action to certain schools, you should expect to have your financial aid applications submitted by those dates and regular decision alike. But importantly, you can check college's financial aid website because they're very detailed in terms of, depending on the admission cycle your student's applying on, which actual date your financial aid application will be due along with that admission cycle. Now, sometimes you're going to have to submit documents depending on the application. FAFSA has a verification system where they randomly choose about 4% of all applicants to submit additional information in order to verify their the information they put into the application. CSS Profile schools, on the other hand, always will require you to submit your tax returns and maybe some additional information, but tax returns at minimum. And then, of course, the most important part, when you get your award letters, understand your financial aid package, that's going to be dependent on the admission cycle. So if your student's applying early decision, schools have gotten really good about notifying financial aid almost simultaneously, if not a couple days after, because early decision is binding, of course. So they need to have families know whether they can afford the college that they're going to potentially be bound to attend. Early action schools can be several weeks or even months after, because early action isn't binding. And regular decision, similarly, it would be weeks or even, depending on how early the regular decision date is, could be weeks afterward. But all schools will notify your financial aid package well before the decision date, which for most schools is May 1st, with the exception of early decision. And remember, if you're applying for need-based financial aid, you will apply every year. Colleges will reevaluate your financial circumstances on a year-to-year basis and adjust your financial aid package depending on what your reality is for a certain year. So that could work to certain families' advantage, and it can work to a disadvantage in the sense that if you've had a couple of rough years with COVID and maybe have less earnings, if you're going back into higher earnings over the next 4 years, you could have a reduced financial aid package in future years, if need-based financial aid package. So you need to be aware of that and think about a 4-year plan. And I do work with families on 4-year modeling to kind of understand not just what that first year investment looks like, but really what the 4-year investment is, and compare colleges on a 4-year investment, which is the most important number if you think about that total you need to submit. Now, getting started, FAFSA has certain requirements. So you're going to need to create what's called federal student aid IDs. I have a video on my website that's only 5 minutes that shows you how to do this. It's very easy to follow along. So one parent and the student create separate FSA IDs, and you need your social security number as a US citizen and an email in order to create this ID. And then each parent and student use the FSA ID to complete and sign their respective sections. Now, one thing I will point out is even though the application isn't open, you can create these IDs today. And in fact, you want to create your FSA ID about 3 to 4 days prior to your expected application submission date, because it does take some time for the US government to process these IDs because they're linking these IDs to your social security number. So this effectively becomes your Department of Education ID for life. And so if you're a parent and you have other students that you're going to be, or children, you're going to be applying for financial aid, you're going to use that same ID for the rest of your life. And similarly, your student applicant will use that same ID every year to apply, as well to check federal aid options, including loans and grants. If you're applying for CSS Profile, you're going to, both the student and the parent will use the student's College Board login to complete their respective sections and to submit. So there's no additional logins required by the parent, with the exception of a divorced parent who's non-custodial. I'll talk a little bit about that. But in fact, it's just one ID. It's your students probably already created College Board login that you're going to use in order to complete that. So what you're going to need, you're going to need to use your 2021 federal tax returns. Now, if you are an international family and you're actually filling out the CSS profile, I work with international families to do this. You'll use your respective native tax return. And there are certain rules in terms of how do you count a year if your country does not submit taxes on the regular calendar year, which I can talk about with individual families. You're going to use financial statements for savings, investments, pretty much your assets that are on the data filing. So those are those balances. And I really recommend printing them out because, as I had mentioned, you might be verified, or CSS Profile colleges might ask you for some additional information about your different accounts. And then CSS Profile, you'll need additional information like your home value, mortgage outstanding debt on your property, and that would be true for FAFSA for other properties, second properties you might own. Now, determining application status. For FAFSA, as I had mentioned several times, FAFSA is only eligible for US citizen or eligible non-citizen status. And there's there's information online about what that eligible non-citizen status is. But what I want to emphasize for families is that it's only the student who has to have this US citizenship or status. So if a student has this status, and even if their parents aren't citizens or they're living abroad, their parents are foreign nationals, the student can still apply for FAFSA. So that's an important distinction. It's only the student. So in that case, if the parent is not a national, doesn't have a social security number, there's an alternate process where they can fill out FAFSA information, and they have to do a manual submission. And I work with families on that. For a CSS profile, now, as I mentioned, many domestic students will have to fill this out for schools, but it can be available to international students, and it is the preferred application. If a school is giving need-based aid to international students, they tend to use the CSS profile as that application. So dependency status. So what do I mean by dependency status? This is the determination as to whether a student can apply as an independent or dependent student, meaning do they need their parents' financial information on the form? That would be a dependent student, or can they apply for financial aid with just their information? And generally speaking, FAFSA and CSS profile will consider a student a dependent unless they meet these criteria, which most students coming out of college don't. They have to be older than coming out of high school don't. They have to be 24 or older, married or have children, have been in the military or a veteran of the military, or are under legal guardianship as opposed to living with their parents. Now, quickly touching on what does it mean to apply if you're separated or divorced or single. And the rules are complex. And I have an article on my website that walks you through the rules of how to apply as a single or divorced or separated parent. But for FAFSA has one set of rules and CSS Profile has a separate set. FAFSA, if you're separated or divorced and not living together. So if you're living together, if you've gotten separated or divorced and decided to maintain a household, you're going to have to submit both parents' financial information on the FAFSA regardless of your marital status. But if you're not living together and separated or divorced, it's only the one custodial parent who submits their financial information, which can be clearly advantageous for financial aid purposes because it's less financial information that college has about both parents in order to determine financial need. However, if that custodial parent who's filling out the application is remarried, you must include information about the partner or spouse because it's still considered one household, even if that new spouse has not adopted the student applicant. And we have to think about how is custody determined? You're probably asking. So it has nothing to do with who claims the student on their taxes or who has legal custody as per agreement. Custody status is determined per FAFSA and CSS profile rules as the parent with whom the student has lived more during the 365 days prior to application date or application submission. So this isn't which parent the student lived with more in 2021 or will live more in this current year. It's counting the days prior to the application submission. Let's say it's November 1st, 2022. We look at the 365 days just prior to that. Now, College Board, most colleges have the philosophy that both biological or adopted parents, whether they're married, separated, or divorced, should contribute to their students or their child's education. So about 76% of CSS profile colleges will require both parents to submit information regardless of marital status. And of course, if parents are separated or divorced, that non-custodial parent, so they still have the same rules. So it's the parent with whom the student has lived with more that fills out the primary application with the student. Then the non-custodial parent would fill out the application by creating a separate ID and linking the application through a student ID that College Board sets up. There is a waiver process for a student to try to get the non-custodial parent not to have to submit their information, but this process happens at the college level. So you can't appeal the CSS profile College Board to waive that information. You have to go to each college. One thing I'll also note about custody status is if the student lives with both parents 100% equally, the next rule or the rule that triggers as who the custodial parent is, it's the parent who contributes most financially to that student's well-being. And in the case that parents contribute 50-50, then it does move to the parent who earns more in terms of their earnings and their tax returns. Now, who are these CSS profile colleges? This is a snapshot. I'm not expecting you to memorize this, and this is just a snapshot for domestic students. There are many, many more CSS profile colleges than this that would receive the application on behalf of consideration for international students' financial aid. But I show this because invariably most students are going to have at least one of these colleges on their list that actually will require CSS profile, which means the family will have to complete the CSS profile. So looking at this important concept of expected family contribution and how it's calculated, looking at for this year's graduating seniors, class of 2023, the parent contribution will be made up of a percentage of income based off primarily 2021 tax returns and a percentage of a parent's assets, which are what's reported, those account values of data filing 2022. So it's a little bit of a time travel. And then if the student is earning or has assets in their name, they would be expected to contribute as well. And there would be a percentage of each of those that's added to the parent contribution percentage to come up with the total expected family contribution for the student. Now, what are these percentages? Well, it really depends on your income bracket. So there on the FAFSA side, they look at all of your income that you're reporting and they make certain allowances. I consider them deductions, like allowances for family size, maintaining your family size, allowances for taxes, etc. They come up with this concept of available parent income, and then it would be contributed anywhere from 22 to 47%, different rates depending on your income bracket. CSS Profile has similar allowances, and they have a contribution rate of about 22 to 46%. So it's pretty similar. And then on the student side, if the student is earning, it turns out for the FAFSA, the first $77,600 that's earned is shielded. So it's not considered available to pay for income, college, but every dollar above that, students expect to contribute 50 cents on that dollar. CSS Profile colleges, most of those colleges expect 50% of income reported to be contributed to college. And in fact, they actually have what's called a minimum earning contribution. So they expect, even if a student on their CSS profile application isn't reporting any income, that they would expect the student to have some kind of summer job, et cetera, and have some minimum earning contribution that would be added to that expected family contribution. So looking at what income is reported, again, I'm taking most of this language for domestic students, but it would be similarly for international students. So you want to take your 2021 federal tax returns, and it would be based off of that. It's going to capture all income that's in your adjusted gross income, which is essentially your taxed income. So one of the things I point out to families is that's much more than your employment earnings. It's not just for your wages or what you earn on your job. It includes capital gains. It could include benefits for unemployment. It could include your retirement benefits that you might be receiving. It can include dividends. So it can include earnings or profits from a company you have or from real estate. So it's anything that's taxed is the starting point of income that has to be reported. But there are many types of 2021 untaxed incomes that are required to be reported as well. I have some examples down there. Surprisingly, contributions, pre-tax contributions to retirement are required to be reported, contributions to a health savings account, child support in the US. If you receive child support, it's not taxed, but it has to be reported and is included as income. And as you can see here, across from child support, any money a student receives or bills that are paid by relatives outside their main family has to be reported by the student as untaxed income. Now, for assets contribution, it's a much smaller contribution rate. So available assets are assets that are available after certain allowances are provided either by FAFSA or CSS Profile. And you can see here the contribution rate is around 5%. It's a little bit higher for up to a little bit higher for FAFSA, and it could be lower for CSS Profile colleges. Now, on the student side, you can see clearly that contribution rate is a lot higher if the students have any assets in their name, whether it's checking, savings, investments, et cetera. Because they're the recipient of financial aid, they're expected to contribute a much higher rate. And these contribution rates that I'm stating are on an annual basis, just to be aware. So what are some of the types of assets that are reported? It's much more than 529 plans or trusts that are dedicated to the student. It's anything that's savings or investment that's not in your retirement accounts. So it's checking and savings, it's CDs, it's brokerage bonds, stocks, mutual funds, that's not your retirement, non-retirement annuities, and you can see the list here. I highlight 529 plans for U.S. For U.S. families because the rules are kind of complicated. I work with families individually. There's certain ways that you can report less money potentially if you end up having your 529 plans controlled in a certain way by certain account holders. And then trusts, that specifically UTMA and UGMAs, which are student types of trusts, those are treated a certain way and can be more favorably counted if you know the certain rules and how to manage those accounts. Now, in terms of other assets that were reported for FAFSA and CSS Profile, again, remember, these are equity value at the date of filing. Personal business assets may be required. So FAFSA has a small business exemption rule, so that if you have a business that employs fewer than 100 full-time employees or the equivalent, and you own more than 50% of the business, you don't have to report your business assets. But at larger businesses, you do. And CSS Profile, however, does require you to report any businesses in which you're a part owner and in a large amount of detail. So I work with business owners quite a bit to help them navigate through that process. And then, of course, if you own second properties or real estate beyond your primary home, both FAFSA and CSS Profile require you to report the equity value of all those properties, regardless of where they're owned, both domestically and abroad. Now, the primary home is one of the assets that many CSS Profile colleges look at, and it has to be reported on CSS Profile in order to determine your ability to pay. And this surprises a lot of family and can cause a lot of stress because many, at least in the US, many families only own their primary home. They don't have second properties. And we know in the US, I think globally as well, properties have probably increased quite a bit in the past several years. So what I want to emphasize is I work with families to understand the rules because each college assesses home equity differently. So you can see a list of colleges here that require CSS Profile, and you can see how they count home equity. So even though you're reporting your home equity information on CSS Profile, Stanford, Princeton, and MIT disallow or don't even look at that when they're calculating your total assets considered available for college. Certain colleges like Cornell, Dartmouth, Carnegie Mellon, Tufts will cap your home equity value at a multiple of the income you're reporting. And finally, Brown, NYU, and Notre Dame, and many colleges just look at your full home equity as part of your ability to pay. Now, how can this potentially impact you? So I worked with a family last year who had about $750,000 of home equity. They had paid off their home. Then they had a modest income, and they didn't have many assets beyond that other than in retirement. So you can see that depending on how home equity was counted, this first set of schools didn't count it at all. The second set of schools capped it at 1.2%, times income, or 2 times income, depending. You can see their asset value was very different from 0 to 750, and it had a significant impact on financial aid awards. So the most generous schools were the ones that ignored home equity, and they were predicted to get the highest financial aid awards from need. And then the schools that use full home equity, it really impacted the family's number when it was calculated for EFC and as well their financial aid package. CSS Profile has a certain advantage because the last screen of the CSS Profile is what's called Special Circumstances screen. And I help families with this because this is your real opportunity to pre-appeal. In the form, there are certain questions that you're going to be asked, and it's a very straightforward, well, I shouldn't say it's straightforward, there's a lot of information, but in terms of they're asking numbers and facts. This is an opportunity to create a narrative to advocate for yourself and your situation and explain special circumstances that might be impacting your ability to pay for college. And it's really important when you do this to be specific about the cash available and your ability to pay. So it's really important. And when I work with families on appealing financial aid as well, after their financial aid offers, I really help on crafting the language to help bring evidence to the appeal, because colleges really need specific numbers in order to have an effective appeal and to change your expected family contribution. So one thing I'll just point out, this was the title of an article, a screenshot from the Chronicle of Higher Education, is that CSS Profile is a pretty grueling process. They say FAFSA is tough, CSS Profile is grueling, because there's just a next level of detail that CSS Profile asks for every financial category and may require you to do calculations, to do valuations. And you can see there's a big difference in the questions. So this is a screenshot of all the sections of parent income and parent assets. This doesn't even include student information, et cetera, just from the CSS Profile. And every one of those opens up into additional subsections and questions. So that's kind of an overview of need-based financial aid. I'm going to turn to merit aid now, because if you calculate your EFC, and you could be surprised by the number, and it could be higher than the cost of education, like we had seen at the case of UCLA, you're going to want to understand the merit process. And the merit process has become more complicated, specifically in the last decade, because you have different types of merit aid that are coming from a college that can substantially reduce your cost of college for all 4 years, but they're going to require a lot of planning and understanding. So the first type of merit aid is admissions committee merit aid. This is the more traditional merit aid that families are familiar with, and a process that they've heard about, which is as soon as your student applies for admissions, they are considered for any merit scholarships through the admissions application, just because they applied. And most of these are automatic consideration. Sometimes on the Common App, it asks the student to opt in order for them to be considered for merit. Don't know why, because we know why wouldn't you want to be considered for free money, but sometimes you have to opt in. But really what I want to emphasize, the when to apply, many colleges are now giving extra consideration for more merit aid to students based off of an earlier submission of even a regular decision application. I'm going to walk through some examples, but timelines are so critical now. If you're looking for merit aid, they're as critical as the admission application timelines. The second type is scholarship committee. So what this means is that colleges have substantial scholarships, could be full tuition or half tuition, but it requires a separate application on top of the admissions application. And these separate applications piggyback off admissions. So they might grab information on GPA and testing, but they may have additional requirements like essays, supplementals, or even nominations from teachers or counselors at your school to even be in that scholarship consideration. And really importantly, when to apply for this scholarship committee type of merit aid is that the deadlines are independent of the admissions deadlines and oftentimes can be earlier. And I'll walk you through some examples of that, but goes back to saying that your deadlines and your timelines for merit aid are as important if you're really looking to maximize your merit aid as the timelines for your admission application. The final type that comes from colleges, what I call, generally speaking, department committee scholarships. So what this means is that students aren't merited awards at the admissions level, at a scholarship committee admission level, but in fact, individual schools or departments within their college or the university they'll be attending have substantial scholarship opportunities. And typically what will happen is there's an individual application for these individual scholarships through a portal. A lot of these schools, and this is specifically true of public institutions in the US, the public school system, the state schools, they have scholarship databases that open up to students. And students have access to these scholarship databases right after they apply, but before they're admitted. And they could match to various scholarships. Some of these scholarships can be sizable, $5,000, $7,000, $10,000, but they're matching based off of their major, their intended career, maybe a club or identity or certain talent they have. And importantly, again, the deadlines are independent of their admission application deadline and can be earlier, or certainly independent of their admission to college. So I've often see a lot of these scholarships deadlines are in January and February. And if the student doesn't apply by then and they get admitted in February or March, they can't be considered for those scholarships because those deadlines have passed. So I really encourage you guys to understand what that process looks like. Now, giving you some examples of the admissions committee. So, again, the mantra that merit deadlines are as important as admission deadlines. So if your student is considering, let's say a student's considering this at a college, Southern Methodist University, Wake Forest College, Grinnell College, University of Southern California, Northeastern University, all the regular decision admission deadlines are in January, which is what the majority of colleges are for regular decision. But if the student wants to be considered for merit aid, you can see their regular decision applications have to be submitted much earlier than the standard deadline. So you can see for Southern Methodist University, they have to have their regular decision application submitted as early as November 1st. For Wake Forest, it's November 15th. For Grinnell College, it's December 1st. For University of Southern California, they have changed their policy that they require the student to apply early action in order to be considered for merit aid by December 1st. And the Northeastern is the outlier, where as long as you submit your regular decision application by the traditional deadline, you can be considered for maximum merit aid. Now, in terms of scholarship committees, I can talk about some of these scholarships. I think all of the scholarships I've listed here are full tuition. Tulane's Dean Scholarship, Villanova's Presidential, Davidson has the Belk Scholarship, Emory has the Woodruff Scholars, and Vanderbilt has the Ingram Scholars. So these are pretty sizable. Like I said, most colleges that have a scholarship committee are looking at students and they're awarding full tuition or half tuition scholarships. So these are the scholarships we want students to get. Again, the regular decision admission deadlines are in January, but if students want to be considered for these premier scholarships, their scholarship application deadline is a separate deadline from their regular decision or potentially, early action admission deadline. So Tulane, if you want to be considered for Dean Scholars, they require you to apply early action to Tulane. You can't apply regular decision, and you have to submit your specific scholarship application by December 1st. Villanova, December 1st for scholarship, and then regular decision needs to be in by December 5th. Davidson, scholarship application by December 1st, regular decision application by December 15th. So you can see how timelines can become complex. So it's really important. Best practices, you have to create a plan with timelines based on merit application deadlines and requirements. You really want to encourage your students to check their portals regularly because they could be getting updates about the process. If they need to go through an interview, they miss that interview date, they're going to be out of the running. And what's frustrating for a lot of parents is only students get access or an ID to log into their admissions portal. And sometimes students aren't as careful. So you really want to encourage your student to be in that portal, understanding that, as well as they may very quickly after they get an admissions portal access, they're going to get potentially the opportunity to search school-specific databases to do that match to departmental scholarships. And when a school is awarding more departmental scholarships, student can apply for scholarships every year. In fact, I've seen in these databases, there are scholarships that are only for sophomores, only for juniors, only for seniors, because they spread that money out and give a student multiple opportunities to go back and try to reduce the cost of college and earn merit scholarships. Now, I have a software I work with that generates custom reports for all college scholarships for schools on your students list. And these reports include academic and other requirements. They include submission deadlines and actually links to the scholarship websites themselves. And I'll talk about it in a minute, but I have a service where I can generate this report for up to 30 colleges. So you can see this is an example of the report. This is for Dickinson College. It talks about the scholarship types, the amount, who's eligible, including at times if international students are eligible, as well as the deadlines that are really important. And you also get a lot of great data about the percentage of students receiving scholarships, what's the average amount, et cetera. But as well as I mentioned, these link to very specific scholarship information on each college website. So that can be a really great resource for families who are looking to maximize merit scholarships from colleges themselves. So I just want to end real quick to talk about a couple of plans that I have. It's particularly for senior families. So I have plans that focus on helping you be successful with FAFSA only, if you're only applying to FAFSA schools, FAFSA and CSS Profile, which would apply to international families. And as I said, hunting for merit scholarships. So that package includes me working with you to understand colleges' generosity and generating a very detailed list for up to 30 colleges to see what kind of merit opportunities your students can match to. And because you're attending the webinar, I actually have a discount for you all. If you use the code CMM Success before October 1st, the plans are normally somewhere between $495 and $595. Now they're under $500, any of these plans. I also have more premium services if you wanted even more support than that in terms of that. And I also have some workshops coming up that are paid workshops because they go into next level detail for very important reasons. So CSS Profile, I have workshops on the open date, which is October 1st, October 15th, and November 5th. And then for single divorce parents trying to navigate, I have a workshop that's an hour plus 30-minute Q&A. And these workshops are limited to 10 and they're meeting style. So this is not a lecture. This is really a conversation about being successful and walking through these different applications. So you can always feel free to just email me if you have questions about these programs, but they're on my website as well. And I'm happy to take a couple minutes to answer questions you all have. So we have a really important question. One person asked, if the student has a social security number, in other words, they're US citizens, but the parent is not, how do you get an FSA ID for a parent? So that's a great question. So what happens is the student logs in and the parent can complete the parent section through the student's student's FSA ID. But what they have to do is the student would electronically sign the FAFSA, and then they would have to print out a paper copy of that application, and the parent would have to actually physically sign it, and it has to be mailed in. So it's a slightly more complicated process, but it is absolutely something that could happen. And I've worked individually with students and families to help them navigate how to do this if the parent is a non-citizen, but the student has citizenship status. And the other question that came up, which is a great one, are scholarships still being considered by SAT, ACT, GPA, regardless of test optional policies? And to answer your question, so essentially a lot of schools don't require the standardized tests, but they may have scholarships that have next to them certain testing minimums. And it really, we have to do the research at a college level. Some colleges have also waived the testing minimum for scholarship consideration, and some schools have not, believe it or not. So they may admit a student when it comes to, a test optional that hasn't submitted a test score, but that student may be excluded from certain scholarships because they don't have a test score and therefore couldn't qualify. So it's going to depend on the specific school. Anyone else have questions?